What do a Reformed Christian and a Luciferian have in common? Well, we both argue with King James only advocates. Welcome back to This is Ben, and I want to talk about Mr. Kevin X. Bivens. I apologize if I'm saying your name wrong. He's a member of the Lucifer Gang. So obviously, up front, not a Christian or conservative organization by any stretch of the imagination. But I became very aware of one of his videos that he made talking about Christianity. And there was a lot to it. It's a little bit of an older video, but I just became aware of it a couple weeks ago. And I want to go over it. I want to review it because there are a couple of things in the video that I actually found interesting. There are some points that we would actually agree on. There are many points that we would disagree on. And he has a lot to say about the King James Bible and King James and history and just Christianity in general. So I thought it might be interesting. Some of the areas, like I said, we have agreement. Some of the areas we have severe disagreement. And some of the areas I think he's just a little bit inaccurate, maybe historically or just functionally in how Christianity works and Bible translations and things of that nature. But it is interesting to see people from two totally different worldviews interact. And so I'm going to go through it. There's a couple things in the video that I don't touch on, but I'm going to try to touch on most of what he said. So let's go ahead and get into it and we'll break it down. Okay, here we are in his video. It's called Religious Supremacy, Oppression, and Misinformation. Like I said, there's going to be a couple of things that I'm going to skip, like his intro, a couple of things that he mentions here and there. But I want to hit on the main topics. So this first subject I want to mention is going to be around the 52-second to a minute and 10 mark right here.
For one, most people that I ask that follow the King James Version Bible, ask them, do they know who King James is? No, this isn't a time for LeBron James jokes. Ask them who King James is. They can't tell you. Ask them when the Bible was written, who wrote the Bible. Not many can tell you.
That's true. That is very true. Most people don't know who King James was. Most people don't know anything about the King James Bible. Most people don't know where it came from. They don't know why it was written. They don't know how it was translated. They don't know the source material. Unfortunately, Mr. Kevin doesn't really know him too much about the translation process himself. He goes on to say why he believes it was written and give a little bit of a historical precedence. But I'm going to make some remarks on the translation process itself. Now, this would be interesting, I think, for Mr. Kevin and anybody else watching. Now, this is the King James Only Controversy by James White. It's a good book, talking about the King James book and the issues with King James Only advocates, which is probably a place for me and Mr. Kevin here. We'd be in agreement. We do encounter probably a lot of King James Only advocates. But I want to talk about just a couple of points about how the King James was translated, right, in translation in general. But this is from his book. This is on page 115. First, the work was done in a way similar to that done with many modern translations. That is, by committees. 6 groups meeting at Westminster, Oxford, Cambridge, worked on the Old and New Testament translations. So as is the case with many modern-day translations, it's not just one person or one group, it's several groups. It's hundreds of individuals, dozens of individuals, many different organizations, using manuscripts and historical data and textual criticism. So it's not a small feat to create a translation. So in the same way, the King James translation was done in a similar way. Second, the KJV translators were not infallible human beings. And this is an interesting point that needs to be brought up with the King James and people who are King James only advocates. And that the point is that the King James Version translators would not hold to the idea that the King James Bible is the only authoritative translation that ever needs to be made, and they wouldn't agree that, well, we got it now, so we're done. They didn't even believe that about their own translation. They didn't think it was infallible. They didn't think that they were infallible, and they did not believe that no updates or translational amendments needed to happen, right? They would not have held to that position. Third, the translators were Anglicans, members of the Church of England. It is common for KJV-only folks to attack men like Westcott and Hort for being baby sprinklers, yet the KJV was born in the heart of such a theological system. So the Anglican Church came out of the Elizabethan settlement, which was where the church would be Protestant in its nature and theology and doctrine, but Roman Catholic in its liturgy, the way it presented itself. So it was her attempt to kind of mold the two churches together in order to end the violence, because you had the Mary Tudor before that, and you had, who's known as Bloody Mary, who had at least 200 Protestant ministers burned at the stake once she ascended to the throne and took power. And then many of the Protestant ministers fled to places like Geneva, where Calvin was. And then we have, obviously them coming back, and they came back Puritans, and then, a lot of history going on there. But yeah, so it is interesting. So it is weird when KJV only people go after people who held to the beliefs that the translators of their Bible held to. Fourth, the translators were given certain guidelines under which to work. Some of the rules of interest include the following. The ordinary Bible read in the church, commonly called the Bishop's Bible, is to be followed and as little altered as the truth of the original will permit. So they use the Bishop's Bible as much as possible, and they were to not alter or to fall away or change anything from the Bishop's Bible unless it was absolutely necessary or could be shown or proven in Scripture that the Bishop's Bible was totally in error. The old ecclesiastical words to be kept vis-a-vis the word church, not to be translated congregation. Interesting, right? Because there's a state church. The Anglican Church is the state church, so they don't want congregation. They want to keep the word church. When a word hath diverse significations, that to be kept which hath been most commonly used by most of the ancient fathers. So even if the early church fathers, right, the patristics, if most of the church fathers have been using a word or a phrase, we want to keep that. We don't want to change it, even if the word or phrase they were using was wrong. No marginal notes at all are to be affixed. That's interesting. But only for the explanation of the Hebrew or Greek words, which cannot without some circumlocution, it's a big word, be so briefly and fitly expressed in the text. So not lots of notes. We don't want people looking too much into it. When any place or special obscurity be doubted of, letters to be directed by authority to send to any learned man in the land for his judgment of such a place. Now that is interesting, right? If we have an issue where we don't understand or we're not sure, then we'll ask an expert.
These translations to be used when they agree better with the text than the Bishop's Bible.
Tyndale's, Matthews, Coverdale's, which churches, Geneva, etc. These information guidelines reveal that the KJV relied heavily upon previous translations, prompting us to ask KJV advocates, when the KJV gives a reading that is identical to the Bishop's Bible, was the Bishop's Bible inspired and inerrant in that place even before 1611? So just a bit of an interesting look at some of the translation guidelines, rules, which they used and utilized when they were talking about the KJV, when they were translating KJV. Because one of the things that Mr. Kevin puts forth is that it almost seems a bit conspiracy theory-esque, right? Like King James just wanted a Bible, and all these translators and all these churches needed a Bible, and they wanted it to sound more kingly so that they could oppress the people, and that was the only reason that they made it. And it is misleading. It's extremely simple, and it's just not correct, historically inaccurate. There is so much more that goes into it, and to just boil it down to a brief statement that they did it like this, they wanted more power, they wanted to subjugate people. It's just simply incorrect, unfortunately.
We update cars every year or two. We update phones every year or two. But we are living in the year 2020 with the mindset of those that lived in the year 1611. That sounds a little primitive if you ask me.
So in a way, he's correct. We do update everything, and updates are important. They are very important. In fact, that's what this is. So this is the English Standard Version of the Bible. This is the version that I use. It is an updated version. And every so many years, we update this Bible based on this. Now, this is the Nestle All-In 28. I think they might be on the 29th version now. And if you read this, it's New Testament Greek. It's minuscule. You will see things at the bottom, right? Those are the notes. And I know it's kind of hard to see. It doesn't want to focus. But it'll have a note. And what happens is that if there's a textual variant, an issue where two manuscripts disagree or several manuscripts disagree, it's known as a variant. And then we'll have scholars look at those variants, go back to the earliest papyri, vellum manuscripts. They'll look at the minuscule, the majuscule, and they'll, we make a decision based on many different criteria. Depends on the textual variant. But textual variants aren't really all that common in terms of viable textual variants, meaning that most of the variants we have are relevant to the text. They don't affect it at all. It might be a word order difference or a spelling difference, capitalization, something like that. But yeah, so this Bible right here, the English Standard Version, would be the Bible I use, and we do update. We don't stick to the 1611, and it's also not an update, a linear progression of updates. Now, a lot of people misunderstand this. They'll look at the ESV. They'll say, "Oh, well, the ESV. Well, before the ESV, what do we have? Like, the NIV or the KJV. After we had the New King James, and they had the King James, and they had the Bishop's Bible, and they had the Geneva Bible, and you had the Latin Vulgate, and you had the Septuagint, right? And so they think there's a linear progression where we just started with one and we kept translating from that one, translating from that one, translating from that one. No, that's not what happened. What we did is we actually go back, look at the earliest manuscripts, look at the earliest attestation in terms of written copied manuscripts, and then we do our updates from that. So it's not like the King James Version came and then the New King James Version was a direct translation of the King James Version, and then the ESV was a translation off the New King James Version. It's not linear like that. I hope that makes sense. It's not just one translation and then we just copy that one, copy that one, copy that one. That's not how it works. So it's much more historic. We go much further back than that.
Faith is not evidence. Just because you believe something doesn't mean it's true.
That's true. Just because you believe something doesn't mean it's true. Just because I believe God is true, just because I believe that Jesus Christ is the second person of the Trinity, that doesn't make it true. And in the same way, just because Mr. Kevin doesn't believe in God, doesn't believe that Jesus is a member of the Trinity, doesn't believe he's God, doesn't make that true. In the same way that if a Mormon believes that God the Father was once a man, a fallible man, who just, followed the Mormon rites and rituals, and then he ended up, in the third heaven, and then he got his own universe and planet, right? Just because people believe something doesn't actually make it true. It's the evidence that we provide to prove whether or not it's true. So I do agree with this statement.
If you go to a court of law, you have to provide evidence to back your claim, to back your story. If you take the Bible away from Christians, what evidence do you have? The Bible itself is not evidence, it is a theory. So again,
incorrect. The Bible is actually evidence, and if you've ever looked at something such as the resurrection of Jesus, scholars like Gary Habermas have done a lot of work on this. I have his book on my shelf. I'm not sure where it's at right now. Maybe down here. But the Bible has been used as evidence for many, many things. The resurrection, not withholding archaeologically, especially the Old Testament. So much of what we understand about the Old Testament, obviously referring to Jews, but to other people, Babylon and the Assyrians, and archaeological digs that we find now. People use the Bible as evidence for that. We use the Bible as evidence for some of the first century people we know. For instance, Pilate, right? Pilate was thought to be a fake figure. People didn't think it was a historic figure. But then we found an inscription talking about Pilate being the prefect of Judea. And so there are characters, people in the Bible, historical characters that we come across all the time. There are archaeological digs that we come across all the time. There are many, many things that the Bible speaks about, that it records historically, that we find out are true later on. It's happened over and over again. And lots of people use the Bible, both Christian and non-Christian, depending on what the subject is that you're talking about, obviously. When it comes to the resurrection of Jesus, the New Testament is, of course, the primary source document for that, and for all claims Christian. So to just simply throw the entirety of the Bible out the window and say, well, the Bible isn't evidence, that's just an inaccurate statement, I'm afraid.
Take away the King James Version Bible. If you take away all Bibles, what can you say to prove your claim that God is real?
Well, that is an interesting statement, because you probably could arrive at a deistic God, right? There's many people that argue things like this. For instance, if you speak with, or if you go to or watch a mainstream apologist like a William Lane Craig or a Frank Turek, men like this, they'll argue for almost a deistic God, which I don't really like the way they argue, and I don't like their Molinism or their theology. But it is interesting because they'll talk about things like the Kalam cosmological argument, right? And there's philosophical arguments that you can use for deducing that a God exists. There's lots of ways that you can, look and decide whether God exists, whether he doesn't exist, kind of what he's like. But it is true that if you take away all revealed scripture, the only God that you're going to come up with is a deistic God of some kind. Maybe a generic God, a God who created the universe, put the laws of nature in effect, because the universe does seem to be extremely fine-tuned. I have found the cosmological argument to be extremely powerful and very convincing. to show that the universe could not have started the way that it did by mere chance. I think the kind of neo-Darwinistic, the old school, there was nothing, and then there was something, and then nothing exploded from nothing, right? Now, lots of people don't hold to that. They'll hold to string theory or multiverse or some version of those. But eventually, you do have to get back to the original uncaused first cause, right? This philosophical argument. So there are many ways to reason backwards or to deduce from nature itself, from philosophy, from history that a God exists, right? You can make that argument, but the idea that we'd be able to specifically come across Jesus and the Trinity and the Father and the Holy Spirit, and the apostles and all this stuff without any scripture, without any revelation from Him, well, that part is true. So we may be able to deduce a God, but we wouldn't be able to deduce the God.
God is real. Usually at this point, this is where someone interjects and says, well, God created himself. Prove it. Still.
Now that's interesting. Now he says, well, at this point somebody will say, God created himself. Well, the problem is that God is not a created being. He was never been created, right? This kind of points back to that philosophical reasoning I was talking about earlier. Eventually you're going to have to come to the idea of an uncaused first cause, right? So that uncaused first cause is going to be the initial cause for everything else, and is going to have to be infinite. It's going to have to be immaterial, all-powerful, right? These properties that we know have to exist for whatever the initial cause was. And obviously the initial God, or the initial cause, is uncaused, because if something before him caused it, or something before it caused it, when you go, well, what caused that? Well, then what caused that? It's known as infinite regression. This is an issue that Mormons sometimes will deal with, and their answer is usually, well, there's an infinite number, but that's obviously a philosophical impossibility, a true infinite, because this goes back forever. And if you're talking about infinite and there's an infinite amount of gods, well, you have this God, well, if infinite that way, infinite this way, there's no beginning, and there's issues philosophically with that. But yeah, the idea that God created himself, if anybody has ever said that to you, Mr. Kevin, then they don't understand Christianity, theology proper.
It's easy to me that even Christians with the Bible still spread misinformation about God, Jesus. For one, his name is not Jesus. His name is YHWH. And no, it is not equal to Yahweh. It has no pronunciation.
Kind of true. So Yahweh is obviously the YHWH is known as the Tetragrammaton, and it is the Old Testament abbreviation for God. Because what happened was, sometime in history, the Jewish people who were writing about God and writing the name took it so seriously that they didn't want to write his whole name out, because they didn't want to be disrespectful or do it wrong or something. So they ended up leaving parts out, and they just abbreviated it. Well, sometime throughout history, we lost the original rendering. So Yahweh is the believed rendering of the Old Testament God, using Hebrew and stuff like that. That one's a little bit out of my depth, the history of that one. But most likely it was pronounced Yahweh. Yeah, but that's known as the Tetragrammaton, the YHWH, tetra, meaning four, obviously. So that's a little bit of where that comes from.
It has no pronunciation that anyone actually knows of.
And like I said, we don't know precisely the pronunciation, but we're fairly certain that Yahweh is correct.
Over the years, from Yahweh, Yeshua, Joshua, and at some point, it got boiled down to Jesus. Who the
Go ahead and stop him before he uses profanity there. That's incorrect. So he just assumes, again, a linear progression, right? Yahweh, and then it kind of made its way to Yeshua, and then it kind of made its way to Joshua, and then it kind of made its way to Jesus. That's not how it works. For instance, if you just look here in the Nestle-Aland, the original Greek, you'll find that his name is actually Jesus. It is Iota, Eta, Sigma, Omicron, Upsilon, Sigma. Jesus. I don't know if you can see that. It's real small. Right there, yeah. It's probably not going to focus. My head's in it. But his name is Jesus, and Jesus is just the English rendering of Jesus. So, again, just an misunderstanding of how things come down the line, right? So it wasn't a linear progression of Yahweh, and then it kind of moved to Yeshua, and then it kind of moved to Jehovah, right? And that's more of a German thing, and then it kind of moved to Joshua, and now we have Jesus. That's just, I think it's just a misunderstanding on his part. That's just historically incorrect.
Satan, Lucifer, the light bearer, is also misrepresented these days. A lot of people say that he's red, he has horns, he was a beast. Show me the Bible verse that says that. This is not up for debate. That is not in there. I read the Bible, I study the Bible, and I can tell you for sure that description of the devil, the most feared man in existence, is incorrect. To be spoken of as the most evil being in existence, God created.
So that part is right. A lot of that comes from medieval or the dark period paintings and glass and depictions. Some of it comes from the Book of Revelation and people taking things literally when they shouldn't take things literally. Yeah, some of that is just cultural misunderstandings. Some of it is hyperbolic, intentional misunderstandings where they would create pictures or stained glass windows or just like paintings of Satan looking sometimes obviously satirically over the top. They hyperbolically make him a true dragon with all these horns, and they give him all these things. Yeah, some of that was just a way to paint a picture for people in the Middle Ages who couldn't read, who couldn't write, who didn't have the ability to comprehend things like that. So they would, you've all seen the windows, the stained glass windows in the paintings of Lucifer with a pitchfork and things. And so some of that was a way to mock him. Some of it was a way to just kind of create, sometimes probably fear in people's eyes. Some of it was a way to capture maybe the eschatological depiction of Satan from the Book of Revelation. But I do find it kind of ironic that Mr. Kevin says, well, he doesn't look anything like this. Show me a verse where he's described like this. I can't believe people think he dresses like this. Let's just, I wasn't going to do this, but let me just real quick. Let's take a look at the Lucifer Gang. Let's just go to Lucifer Gangs, put in there. Okay, so this is Mr. Kevin, the one that we're looking at right now. You see he has red eyeballs. I don't know if those are contact lenses or if he has actually dyed his eyes red and black, give himself a more demonic look. Here's a picture of him. He's got that again. He's got, I think, vampire teeth going on here, it looks like. Got some vampire teeth. He's wearing red. And this thing from Instagram, he's got the red background, trying to look very evil. Here we go, Kevin X, Devil's Tongue. Here he is. He's got horns on his head right here, right? So horns right here. So it is kind of interesting, possibly a little bit ironic that Mr. Kevin seems to be taking issue with the way people depict Satan, Lucifer, and evil when he himself utilizes those same things in his videos. So yeah, it's a misrepresentation, but it is being promulgated by both sides, unfortunately.
All evil in this world. Here's the Bible verse that says so.
So he's going to go on to say that God created all evil in the world. There's going to be two issues with this. First is that this is a misunderstanding of what evil is. Now, when people will say this, and people say this all the time, well, if evil's in the world, then God must have created evil. So he is the author of evil. But this is a misunderstanding of what evil is. Evil is just a deprivation, right? It's a loss of something. And what I mean by that is, every time somebody commits evil, they're committing an act of disobedience. So they are disobeying God, and when they disobey God, they are doing something that is evil, right? So thou shalt not murder. When somebody murders somebody, it's disobedience, right? When somebody lies, they're violating the commandment, thou shalt not lie. So all evil is either disobedience or a lack of righteousness, good, or justice. So that's what evil is. So it's not a tentative, viable substance. People talk about evil almost as if it's a physical object that people create, right? So even if you used a physical object, like a knife or a gun, to murder somebody, the evil is not the knife. The evil is the disobedient action itself. So when he says God created evil, well, that's assuming that evil is something that we wield, almost as if it's something we can grasp and use against people that God created. Like God created the knife and then gave it to us, and now we're wielding the thing that he created. That's not what evil is. It's just a misunderstanding, unfortunately. So to say that God is the author of evil is impossible because he's all good, all just. and evil isn't a thing that was created.
Isaiah 45, verse 7, I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things.
Okay, so King James, obviously, and he's, it's easy to do stuff with King James because of the language and the translations. Some of it's just a mistranslation, mistranslated wrong, or it could have been translated better. So let's talk about Isaiah 45, verse 7. Now, Isaiah 45 is good because it's in the middle of Isaiah 40 through 48, which is kind of broadly known as like the test for the false gods, and it gives God's attributes and talks a lot about him. So chapter 45 is about Cyrus. And the heading of the ESV would say Cyrus, God's instrument. He's talking about how God has the power even over people like Cyrus, and this is a prophetic passage talking about Cyrus coming in the future and freeing the Jews from Babylonian captivity. They went under that under Nebuchadnezzar. And so verse 7, I form light and create darkness. I make well-being and create calamity. I am the Lord who does all these things. When the Lord is all capitalized, it means Yahweh, right? So I, Yahweh, do all these things. So in a better translation, unfortunately, the King James it's a bad translation the way they word it here. But he's not actually saying I create evil in the sense of I created evil as an institution or something to wield. It actually should be I create calamity, meaning that God wields even evil people to do his bidding. And so that's a prophetic passage. So that's, it's a bad translation. He's using a bad translation in order to make a point that doesn't really stand, either theologically or philosophically, unfortunately.
Please don't be confused. I don't advocate evil.
Now that's interesting because he's saying he doesn't advocate evil. Well, that would depend on what his definition of evil is, because obviously, as someone who doesn't believe in God, or a God, and he'll go on to say that everybody is their own God, well, to say that I don't advocate evil would mean, well, he doesn't advocate evil as he interprets the idea of evil. But obviously this points back to the issue of standards, right? By what standard? Well, whose standard? Your standard? Well, what about my standard? Because from my standard, he is advocating evil. He is presenting evil. He's obviously speaking blasphemies according to a Christian perspective. But from his perspective, I'd be advocating evil. King James only people would be advocating evil. So which standard do we use? If you don't believe in a God, and you believe everybody is their own God, then there is no real standard of evil and good. It just comes down to pragmatism and who can enforce their version of evil and good onto people. So the idea that he doesn't advocate evil, it's a bit of a non-sentence because there's nothing behind it. It's a bit empty.
Advocate going out into the world and doing crazy things. I want you to wake up and realize that you are your own God. You control your own destiny, your own actions.
You're your own God. You control your own destiny, your own actions. I find that sentence again to be kind of empty. For someone to say to themselves, "I am my own God," even if you didn't believe in the Christian God, it's fairly arrogant, unfortunately, to say that I control my own destiny, I control my own purpose, my own life. Well, you do to an extent, but even your life, as someone who believes that you're your own God, is controlled and conformed by society around you, by institutions, by family members, by friends, by your job. There's lots of factors to just, some people say, I am my own God. Again, it just, even if I wasn't a Christian, would come across that statement. It seems packed with a little too much hubris, I think, for my liking.
You are in control. You don't have some little red demon guy telling you what to do. You don't have some giant white guy watching over you. If that's the case,
another misunderstanding. White guy. People usually get that from the Middle Ages, where Jesus and the apostles were depicted as white, and that wasn't because of white supremacy or any kind of a racist notion like that. That's just because people at that time didn't travel more than a few miles from their house. I mean, even if you lived in a big city, you didn't really travel. Very few people traveled. But even if some of those people did travel, they didn't travel outside of their countries, or they didn't travel outside of their kingdom, or what it might be. So when they would paint depictions of Christian, historical Christian passages or things that happened in the past, they would just paint what they knew, and they just knew the people around them. So the idea that and he didn't say this, but it's just kind of someone to clear up that Jesus is some skinny, tall white guy with flowing blonde hair and all that. That's of course false. We know that's not the case. Yeah, the reason that happens is because people just painted what they knew, and what they knew was the people they saw around them, and most of those paintings came out of Christian nations, which happened to be in Europe at the time.
Why don't you believe in Santa Claus? Why don't you believe in the Tooth Fairy? Why don't you believe in the boogeyman and monsters under your bed? Because they don't have hell and punishment attached?
No, it's because there's no proof that they exist. That's the main reason. And I hear this argument a lot from Richard Dawkins and people like that. Why don't you believe in the flying spaghetti monster? Well, there's no proof that he exists. Nobody believes in them as deities. The Tooth Fairy doesn't have a following in a religious book. They don't. There's no proof that the Tooth Fairy exists. We know that Jesus existed as a person, even outside the scriptures. Now, there's a whole book called "Did Jesus Exist?" Yeah, I got it right here. Did Jesus exist? A historical argument for Jesus of Nazareth by Bart D. Ehrman, who's very much not a Christian. So there's precedence historically, theologically, philosophically for the existence of a God, and then obviously when you look at the scriptures, there's the proof of existence of a particular, specific God. So yeah, we don't believe in those fairy tale things because there's no proof that they exist.
And don't get me wrong, I was a Christian for many, many years. I started out in the church. My family is very, very Baptist. I was in the church for many years. I played drums, and I sat there many Sundays looking at my pastor, looking at my preacher, and I thought to myself, what is this guy talking about? And the more questions I asked, the more denials I got, the more just believe I was told, the more upset I became, and I went and sought my own answers. And to use a quote from Socrates, I know that I know nothing. And once you realize that, the world starts to change right before your very eyes. You start to realize you're being lied to about everything.
Now, his story is all too common, unfortunately, and this does make a lot of sense because he says, "I sat in a church, I played drums, I was part of the team, and you hear this from so many people. I sang, sometimes I preached, I led a small group, I led a Sunday school, I did missions, I went out and did these things for the church, and they do all these things, but then they have questions, unanswered questions about God, about Christianity, about atheism, about the outside world, and they come to their pastors or they come to their elders or their teachers, and they don't have any idea. They have nothing for them. They don't have answers because they're not studied. They haven't learned. They don't know theology, doctrine, history, philosophy. They don't have answers for them. So you end up just having to live by faith, right? This definition of faith, and that kind of faith is definitely an empty, blind faith where you just believe without studying, without dialoguing and debating and spending time looking at multiple sources and examining your faith and the faith of those around you. And what happens is eventually some people just run out of hype energy, which is pretty much all that is. They go to these churches and they just, they're emotionally drawn in at first, but eventually when they start asking deeper theological, life-altering questions, they typically don't get answers. And then they walk out the back door. It's all too common, unfortunately. I see it all the time, and that's one reason I've started this YouTube channel. That's one reason I, interact with people. That's one reason I do this, is because I want people to have answers. I want people to be correct, and I want them to have a true understanding of theology, doctrine, history, Christianity, and I want them to, obviously the end goal is for them to be regenerated, to come to an understanding and to bow their knee to Christ, to understand who He is, and to spend an eternity with Him. That is the ultimate goal. And I hate that people like Mr. Kevin, coming into the church, and when I say the church, I just mean the church like as an institution, churches, buildings, and groups and people, not the actual body of Christ. And they get in and they, spend time and money and effort and love, and they have connections with people. But when eventually they get to a point where they have so many unanswered questions or contradictory answers to questions that they can no longer just survive off of that blind faith and emotion that I mentioned. The hype goes away and you're left empty, and a lot of times you're left with resentment towards what you think the church is, towards a group of people who you think represent true Christianity who represent Christ and His Word fairly and biblically. And then you end up like this, and I hate it. But I do like Mr. Kevin. Seems like a very intelligent guy. Obviously, we would be on polar opposites in terms of our beliefs, our worldview, our understanding of God and Satan and evil and good. But he is very intelligent. You can tell from his video. He's studied things and he's thought about things. While I do think they're wrong, at least he has given them some thought, which is more than I can say for a lot of Christians I've met, unfortunately. So I hope this helps. I hope that this video has helped. I would suggest go watch this full video. There was a little bit more in there, some intro stuff and some things that I didn't deal with, but I'll get to them. Maybe if there's a follow-up video. But I hope this helps him. I hope it helps you clear up some contradictory ideas that you might have had, some misunderstandings of Christianity, some issues you have with some King James only people, because they are very vocal and loud. But unfortunately, they're incorrect. And yeah, by the way, these books I mentioned, I'll just throw these at the end. Did Jesus exist? If you want to know about Jesus as a historical figure, this is a good book. Now, Bart Ehrman throws a lot of stuff about Q in here and sources that I don't agree with that are not really relevant to the point of Jesus' existence, but that's okay. It's still a good book. The King James Only Controversy by James White, another good book, talks about the King James translation, how it was translation, some of the guidelines, talks about Erasmus and the things that he did, making his Greek New Testament leading up to that, and how he dedicated it to the Pope, and then talks about Jerome. Then you got the Latin Vulgate, and there's just a lot of history here. There's a lot of really good stuff, and there's a lot of good stuff about textual criticism and translations in general, so I would suggest that. And then lastly, I would suggest a good Bible, probably the ESV, that's my personal favorite right now, or the NASB. Maybe the Holman Apologetics Bible is also good. I'm not a huge fan of the NIV, the NLT. I don't really care for paraphrases. I'm just not a big fan of them. I wouldn't use them if I were you, but that's just my personal preference on those. Well, I hope this has helped, guys. Yeah, it's been a good video. Let me know what you thought in the comments down below about what I said. If you want me to address anything else that maybe I missed in the video, or anything that Mr. Kevin has said since then, because obviously this is from April of 2020, so it's quite old, but unfortunately, I just came across it. I'm only one guy. I can't see everything. So let me know in the comments down below. Like or dislike this video, and subscribe to my channel, guys. See you next time.